All right, welcome to our next episode of Correspondence, where we have the honor of talking to Valthero as it goes on Discord. He is an aficionado of all things vintage and especially Sheaffers. So, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Doing fine, doing fine. I can't complain too much. I brought out all my vintages because I knew we were going to be talking about it. So, we'll start with like basics first. So, what got you into
Mhm.
pens before we get into like specifics?
Oddly enough, keyboards. I'm sure some in the hobby may know there's a fairly sizable overlap between mechanical keyboards and fountain pens and other analogs, headphones. Visit the mechanical head pen subreddit. And I had a job as we called it radio testing. Basically, I would ride shotgun in a pre-production test vehicle, and I would just mess with the radio infotainment unit and break what I can break, write up whatever issues I find. And we were using tablets for that. And I hate typing on a screen. So I got myself a Bluetooth mechanical keyboard, a Royal College RK61. And after a little while, the tablets, they were fairly old iPads. They started acting up on us. So we hit an interim a few months while we were upgrading technology where we were going totally on paper. And I thought, well, hell, if I enjoy typing, why can't I enjoy writing? And I got myself a $15 Parker Jotter ballpoint pen.
Nice.
And that was nice. I still have it. Fantastic entry level ballpoint pen if you want to get into fine writing. And I was reading more on pens because I tend to obsess obsessively over my hobbies.
Me too. Yeah, down the rabbit hole.
Yep. Stumbled across fountain pens, and I've always loved old things. So I did what anyone would do. I bought myself a Coeco Sport Classic, checkered blue with a broad nib. And writing with it felt like I was writing with a piece of wet cotton. So I put it in a drawer and I didn't use a fountain pen again for 2 years. One day I was on Reddit, found the fountain pen subreddit, decided to get a Pilot Metropolitan with fine nib, and it was a fantastic pen. I used that pen for months before I got another one. And the next pen, of course, I decided to go more Bugatti, and I got the Platinum 3776 Century
Oh,
in
cool.
I don't remember the name of it, but it's the blue one.
Nice.
And that was a great pen. And number three, I found a dangerous website, Peyton Street Pens. They have all things vintage. I highly recommend. Terry Morris is fantastic to work with. Um,
I'm writing that down right now. I'm not familiar with that site. Yeah, most of my vintage collection has come from secondhand on PenSwap, actually. So,
mhm. Yeah, you can find a lot of good deals on PenSwap as well.
so let's talk more vintages. So you're a history guy. So you went down the vintage rabbit hole. Why did you choose Schaefer over, all of the other brands, Parker, Conklin, maybe Todd, whatever you might have?
I do enjoy Conklin. Maybe Todd. I sold my last one, unfortunately, but I have a couple of pen trays off to the side, which I'm sure we're not going to get to every pen here, but I
Gives us a
don't
chance to
actually
come back for
have
another
this
episode.
tray. Yeah, don't actually have it in one of these trays. But my first vintage pen was from Peyton Street Pens, and it was a gray Sheaffer's Imperial 4 with the long diamond inlaid nib. And that pen was fantastic. I can't describe what a different writing experience it was, especially coming from the Japanese pens, the Pilot Metropolitan and the Platinum 3776 Century. They were both had fairly feedbacky nibs, almost felt like writing with a pencil. And when I inked up the Sheaffer pen, it was like I was writing with a stick of butter on a sheet of hot glass. It was
Yeah.
a
Very smooth.
world-changing moment. And
I
that's when I
noted that.
became a Sheaffer stan.
I noted that in the again the snorkel review, and this is the only Schaefer I've really used, I should say too. But in the 1950s Schaefer review, I noted it was especially for a fine. I usually go bigger and broader,
Mhm.
for that very reason, to make it more inky and more flowy and more smooth. But this thing, even as a fine, it was remarkably smooth.
Mhm.
Do and let me ask you because I don't know. Let me find the camera there. Is this kind of architecture, is that pretty common on the older ones? I know they're not all going to be 360,
Yes.
but do you see how it kind of flares up? Where to go? A little bit at the end, it flares up. Is that on all the older Schaefers?
It's not on all of them. It really started becoming popular around 1930, 1931 with the introduction of the feather touch nib, um, where Schaefer began putting a slight upturn at the tip of the nib. And what that does is it has the effect of, I'm sure you've noticed, if you hold a pen, let me just grab one. We'll go with it. Let's see. If you hold a pen at more of an upright angle, it's scratchier than a lower angle.
Hmm.
And Schaefer noticed that, knew that, put a slight upturn at the tip of the nib to provide an artificially lower writing angle. And that makes the pen write smoother at higher angles.
That's very cool. It's in large contrast. Now, most of my vintage history, I tend to go for superflexes, and they all have this kind of hook down architecture. And here's a 1930s Conklin. I'm trying to
Mhm.
so you can see it, but it's very contrasted with that kind of Schaefer turned up. A lot of the vintage pens that I have that kind of almost hooked down, and I do actually think that kind of gives when people talk about that vintage feel a lot of the time, especially when we're getting into superflexes. I do
Mhm.
think that hook architecture has something to do with like the snapback of when you come out of a broad flex line and you release that kind of architecture kind of snaps it back a little bit quicker. But they're not necessarily as smooth as the Schaefer, definitely. Do you have any thoughts? Are you more on kind of the fine, medium, kind of lower end, or do you go for super flex or like broad? What's your kind of fancy?
I enjoy paintbrushes, which I may have. It's not. See, I got two trays of pens, and then all the ones I want to example are still in the case. Um, if a pen lays down ink like a fire hose, I love it. Got to use the good paper, obviously, but I like broad nibs. I like wet nibs. Not so much a fan of the flexible nibs these days, but I definitely know what you mean with that hook down. And I believe that is both to help strengthen the nib. That I want to put a quick disclaimer. I am not an authority on all things vintage. I'm just a humble enthusiast. So everything that I say, take with a grain of salt. Generally, I'm pretty good on dates when things were released or when things were retired, but this is one of those hypotheticals where I believe, but I don't know, that downturn was for the strength of the nib and, like you said, for the good snapback. Some superflex nibs, I found it's incredibly difficult to write with a fine line, even with the lightest of pressure. But the nibs that I can write with a fine line and then flow into that wide superflex are the ones with that slight downturn.
Cool. And no worries as to kind of aficionado status, because one of the things I've been finding as I'm getting deeper and deeper into the vintage rabbit hole is not, it's a lot of word of mouth. A lot of this is carried by people who love history, and people who love history are kind of backwards looking and they don't necessarily fancy social media. I've actually asked two restorers if they could, come on and interview, and they're like, no, I don't do social media. Like I literally only go on, I sell the vintage pens I restore, and then, I'll write you a letter, analog, but I'm not
Hmm.
really. And the same thing goes for websites. When you look at websites, a lot of the websites with good vintage info, they look like they're from the GeoCities days in the 90s, 2000s. Like they've probably been up and hosted for like 15 years and nobody's touched them. You know what I mean? So like this
Yep.
vintage world is a lot of word of mouth. And that's why I wanted to seek people like yourself out, because there's a lot of knowledge floating around there, but not all of it is tappable on, from the internet realm. And that's what I'm trying to kind of bring a little bit to, is kind of pick a little bit of your knowledge that you have and that you can share. So thank you very much for sharing what you can.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yeah,
Let's see.
when you talk about old websites, of course, Richard Binder's website comes to mind, richardspens.com.
Yep.
Always happy to plug Mr. Bender. His website is a treasure trove of knowledge, all things Sheaffer, all things vintage.
I'll definitely put those links down below, and I'll check those out too and try and get some more history. So from what I know about Schaefer, I'm sure you can fill in some gaps. So the man, he had this jewelry store, and then he kind of, worked on his nights and like developed the lever fill. From what I gleaned, it seemed like he invented the lever fill, but a lot of people kind of sidestepped the patent to use that without giving him royalties or rights. Is that accurate, would you say?
That's fairly accurate. It's so there's a lot of I would say there's a lot of legalness around the history of the Schaefer Pen Company. When Walter designed the lever filler, it was technically something new, but it was just ripping off the internals of Conklin's crescent filler. Um, and there are some other patents that technically Schaefer did patent first, but they were heavily inspired by other things. A lot of people like to say that Schaefer was the creator of the cigar shaped pen, but that's actually not the case. They weren't the first with the streamlined pens,
Interesting.
and I don't remember the company that did them first.
It reminds me almost a lot of like motorcycles, because I'm a big motorcycle guy, or at least I used to be before I
Mhm.
had kids. And when you find, it was almost the same as pens, like in that early 1900 to 1935, 30, late 30s, there was like hundreds of motorcycle companies. And, there were people making, four-cylinder,
Mhm.
six-cylinder bikes, all sorts of things, V-twins, all, like it was crazy. But then kind of Harley came in and kind of like monopolized the V-twin, even though they didn't necessarily create it. And now it's like associated with them, just kind of as an example or like a counterpoint to that. I can see any sort of business is a take and give, and you're always kind of, nothing's created in a vacuum. You're always kind of seeing what's out there, and then whoever seems to like be able to market it and finish it best for the public tends to gain that notoriety. And Schaefer did a great job.
Absolutely. Their marketing was spot on. And part of that marketing was that Walter had a very strict belief that whoever buys a Sheaffer pen should be able to hand it down to their children and their children's children. They believed in quality above all else, and that is something that made it into their marketing. And whoever bought a Sheaffer pen could see and feel the quality. I mean, there's of course the story that Lewis Waterman got into creating fountain pens, started creating safety pens because of a pen that leaked into his business suit.
Hmm. Oh
And
man, I've only ever
Schaefer,
had one experience with a pen leak, so
mm,
hopefully, not again. But yeah, I can see where that would kind of ruin your day, especially if you're at a business meeting or somewhere important.
knock on wood, I've never ruined clothes. I've had
Mine,
pens leak, but I have yet to ruin any clothes.
this 1930s Conklin I recently got, this is my first silicone sack, where all my other ones are restored with latex sacks.
Mm-hmm.
So this, as I was told from the restorer, is more depending on, so some batches were better than others, but the silicone sacks are more prone to potentially leaking if it's carried or stored like flat or nibbed down. Do you have any like insight on the sacks over the years? Were they always silicone and latex? What happened before that?
Absolutely. So latex rubber, the earliest pens were what we refer to as eyedroppers, where much like modern eyedropper pens, people would use a glass eyedropper to drip ink into the barrel of the pen, which is actually how you fill safety pens, you, for the most part, some designs differ, but you put the nib halfway down and then you fill it, and it's neither here nor there. When sacks came into the scene, these were typically rubber, latex rubber, and in fact, there's some history around the Second World War where we can go further into that. Um, and this continued until plastic cartridges really became a thing. Now, there are some exceptions. Parker used what they refer to as plyglass sacks, which are really just a form of PVC
Hmm.
in some of their pens, notably the Parker 51. And it's for
Yep.
that reason that the horribly, horribly dangerous Parker 51 ink and Super Chrome was able to survive in that pen, where they killed every other pen that they came into contact with.
I've heard about certain inks being dangerous, and I heard about that one you don't want to use in lots of other pens. Are what inks do you go to as like a a vintage connoisseur of sorts? What inks do you look for? Do you put into your vintages with Saks?
I I look at it this way: if the ink company was active when the pen was being produced, it should be safe. So Waterman, Sheaffer's, Parker, Aurora, Mont Blanc. There's a real wide swath of inks. Pelican, a few others that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but that's a good starting point. Granted, not every ink from every company is going to be safe with pens as a blanket statement,
Hmm.
but typically a company will have at least some inks that play nice with vintage pens.
What about secondary market like eBay? Like I was looking for some, I think it was Script ink for, Sheaffer or from Sheaffer. Would you recommend trying to snag some like actual vintage inks, or do you think that's kind of hit or miss because they might not have been stored properly?
I a bit of column A and a bit of column B. I have probably close to 3 gallons of script in my case, which I know looks like a bomb went off inside it. I'm selling a lot of pens right now. Um, but for the most part, it's perfectly safe. Especially I find the script, the bottles are sealed very well, and it's pretty easy to tell when you open a bottle if anything is funky about the ink. Even before you open it, all you need to do is set the bottle on a table for a day or so, and then come back the next day, just flip the bottle upside down and see if there's any gunk on the bottom.
Okay, I was going to ask you, like, I've heard to look for kind of little bits of mold or anything that might be floating in the ink, but I was going to ask
Mhm.
you some other attributes that I should be on the lookout for stale ink, but that's good to
Yeah,
know.
a lot of vintage ink you'll find was sealed with some form of cardboard between the glass and the lid itself. So finding some small pieces of sediment inside the ink is fairly common.
Okay.
But if there's any kind of sludge, or I wouldn't worry too much about the smell of vintage ink if you're not already used to what it should smell like. Um, yeah, just watch out for any gunk, and
Okay.
especially anything that seems stringy.
Cool. Going back to you said you could go into more details about the Sacs around World War II. I just love, that era of history in general. Is there any cool other Sac innovations, before they jumped over to, different, types of filling mechanisms like the vacuumatics and things like that?
When I say interesting due to World War II, I suppose a good example would be I have a Sheaffer Valiant. This was a military pen. Let me see if I can get this to focus. There were a
Yeah, that's
number of
cool.
innovations around the Second World War. This pen specifically was created to comply with um, US Armed Forces dress code. If you put a pen in your breast pocket, it cannot bulge over the fabric.
Whoa.
So all the breast pockets had flaps. They don't want an unsightly bulge.
Hmm.
So they came up with what they call the over the top clip. The clip
Yeah, I
fastens
see.
to the back of the cap, goes over the top, and then you clip it in. And what this allows is for the top of the pen to be completely flush when it's in your pocket.
Very cool.
And of course, one fun piece of history is these pens were only sold to US servicemen. And there is a good chance that this pen was in a GI's pocket when he was shooting some Nazi bastard.
That's cool. And it makes more, more rarity too. And more almost in a way, like you said, authenticity, because it was like officially issued to, or not issued, but it was officially bought to, or issued to someone who was actually in uniform. So that's very cool.
Exactly. So, in terms of how this relates to sacks, this pen is a Sheaffer vacuum filler.
Oh, cool.
So,
And what year? Probably like early 40s then.
yes, this pen would be 1941 at the very earliest, possibly 1942. But Sheaffer vacuum fill pens became extremely common during the Second World War for a very simple reason. The Wartime Production Board limited the use of the civilian use of certain war materials, such as rubber. So
So there
Sheaffer
go the
vacuum
sacks.
fillers
Yeah.
use a very small amount of rubber. Of course, by this point, they're past using ebonite or hard rubber for their barrel materials. And you can use a big honkin' rubber sack, or you can use a single rubber gasket. And this way, without the rubber sacks, they were able to outproduce their competition. And their sales numbers show just how successful this strategy was.
Very cool.
So the vacuum fill system debuted in 1934, but it wasn't under the Sheaffer name. They had a number of sub brands, such as one was actually called Vacuum Fill, which I might have one here. Yes, I do. This is an original vacuum fill. So this pen, the original vacuum fills were a little bit different than what you may be used to, where the blind cap was actually fully removed and then you would operate the plunger as such. And this one is actually frozen because it's not restored.
Okay. Now, do you do any restoring, or are you more in the collecting? I don't do any restoring. I'd love to know someday, but as far as right now, it's only as far as vintage pens. I don't know the first thing about taking it apart and getting to the sack and replacing it. But do you do any of that?
I do. Lever fillers are a great place to start because all you need to do is get the section off of the barrel and then replace the sack. All you need is a rubber sack of the appropriate size, some orange shellac, and some talcum powder.
And
Um,
what's the basic process? Do you have to like heat up? Because I've heard that the older nibs are like heat set. Does that mean you have to like heat it up to kind of break the bond so you can remove the section, or
let's see, what would be a good example? I don't have very many lever fillers up here. I guess I'll go with a piece of history. This is an original Sheaffer tuckaway. This is what the first year models look like. And this is a lever filler. So if
a
I
little pocket
can,
pen?
so on this pen, the nib unit is technically the section, but we have our sack. This one is, of course, shellacked on and coated in talcum powder to preserve the rubber and absorb any moisture that may get in the barrel. Basic step by step is you remove the section from the barrel, chisel off the old sack because it is typically ossified. Um, Once you've cleaned up the section, you can stick your new sack on there. I like to use a corner of a paper towel to apply just a little bit of shellac to we refer to it as the nipple, which is where the sack goes. Make sure you don't get any shellac on the feed. It can be a problem on older pens where the feed is flush to the tail of the section. Um, there are special tools, which
I
I'm
was going to
sure
say,
have inside this drawer here.
now, since you started telling me, I just got a little bit antsy and I grabbed a pen and I was like, wow, he unscrewed that really easy. Do my pens unscrew? Probably shouldn't have, but I grabbed my 1930s Conklin. Where is it? Whoop, up there. And I just
Mhm.
started kind of twisting and it did twist, but it didn't feel threaded. It just felt almost like a gunk was kind of like holding it there. I didn't
Mhm.
break the thing just now, did I?
No, probably most likely not. Not every vintage pen is actually threaded. Most of them, I find, Sheaffer likes to thread their pens,
Mhm.
for the most part. But a lot of them you'll find are not threaded and are just friction fit with a little bit of, we'll say shellac to hold it in place.
Okay, okay. I didn't want to go like pulling on the thing or torquing too hard, but it did twist willingly, but it didn't seem like it was going anywhere. So
If it
cool.
twists willingly, then I would say give it a little tug and see if the section comes out of the barrel.
All right. I'm gonna leave that for when I'm feeling a little bit more risky someday. But
Adventurous.
do you have any featured pens in your collection that you want to share?
So feature pens.
Or like favorite pens, maybe not,
I
you
yeah,
know, personal favorite.
I guess we can start at the start, which I have this lovely cardboard box here,
Yeah, cool.
a 1918 Schaefer's number 41 with the beautifully hand engraved 14 karat cap band. And of course, black chased hard rubber. And this is, of course, as I said, lever filler. Lever's a little bit dirty.
Actually, since we're
Um,
talking about ebonite, so my understanding was pretty much all early pens were made of ebonite up until what was it, the Big Red and Parker, and then they started going to red ebonite, and that's when they really started kind of going into other materials. But then all along the way, you would still find some sort of other, I don't know if it's an acrylic or a resin or what, but can you share a little bit more about the history? So were pretty much all pens back in the early 1900s mostly ebonite?
for the most part, if you look back to the um, early 1900s, late 1800s, most pens you'll find will be ebonite. There were some, I don't know if I have any examples right here, right now. No, I do not. Metal overlays were quite
Yes.
popular as well.
I have a wall from
Ah,
1917 and a 10
fantastic.
point, and that's exactly what this is. It's an ebonite body,
Mhm.
base body with like a metal overlay, gold.
Exactly. So in terms of the Sheaffer Pen Company specifically, um, Sheaffer made the switch in 1924 to a material that they called radite, which was a type of paroxylin plastic. Um, Celluloid was quite common to find on pens, which is a delightfully flammable material. In fact, one of the leading contributors to the fact that earlier cinema fires were so deadly was because of celluloid film reels.
Oh,
And of
interesting.
course, the lack of proper exits, but
Yeah.
who needs them?
Wow, that's cool. I
So
love like adjacent history facts. That's cool.
yeah, so when it comes to celluloid, I have a couple of Sheaffer tuckaways here, and these are the gray pearl and the carmine celluloids. Very beautiful striated celluloids
Mhm.
from Sheaffer. Since I already brought up the lever filler, I have a vacuum fill and a mechanical pencil. Tuck away. Um, First introduced in 1941, and they sold like crap. They were specifically marketed towards women. They were supposed to resemble women's lipstick holders, and nobody bought them.
Mhm.
They're fantastic pens, but nobody bought them. So the next year, they changed their tune. They debuted the celluloid clipless tuckaway, which, unlike the previous year, these had Triumph nibs. Um, and this one in particular is, of course, vacuum fill.
Now, what is a Triumph nib? Is that like a particular architecture of a nib, or was that a company that manufactured that nib for Shaver?
All right, now we are going into some proper history. The Schaefer's Triumph is a pen that was introduced right at the onset of World War II. Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, and a few months later, Schaefer reveals this design, which they'd been working on for a few years. And they named it Triumph.
Okay.
Um, the Triumph nib wasn't marketed as specifically the Triumph nib. They called it the wraparound point, et cetera, et cetera. They had a couple different marketing names for it, but we know it today as the Triumph nib because the Triumph is the pen upon which it debuted.
Okay.
And of course, this was incredibly popular.
Hmm.
Um,
Was that the
the
first wraparound nib? Or did other companies already kind of play around with that?
That I'm not sure on. I believe that a couple of Asian countries may have already done wraparound nib designs, and they're more common actually these days, especially with the Monarch nib that I'm
Yep.
sure you've heard of.
And as far as I know, again, I don't know everything certainly, but at least the Schaeffers are the earliest representation from any American company I've seen with that wraparound design.
That is correct. Um, and the nib made its way onto most Sheaffer pen models through the 60s. The Tuckaways, the of course the Triumph. After the war, the Triumph line expanded. But the Triumph line expanded, they had the Triumph Valiant 2, Triumph Statesman, Triumph Craftsman, a lot of pens through the 40s to the 50s,
Hmm.
especially with the onset of the touchdown filling system. Most touchdown filling pens had the Triumph nib. And then when the snorkel came out, and even through the 70s, if you look at the Schaefer's Imperial 3 and some Lady Schaefer models, they have a sort of miniature Triumph nib.
Hmm. What was the intermediate one that you just mentioned before the snorkel? The kickdown, the touchdown?
That would be the touchdown filler. Here is an example of the touchdown. This is a, I believe, a Statesman, if my memory serves me. This one was produced in Canada. It does have an open nib. An interesting note is that the blind cap actually says touchdown.
Oh, cool.
The touchdown filler is an interesting system. It's basically the snorkel without the snorkel.
Okay.
So you have your touchdown tube. It is, of course, pneumatically filled.
Yeah.
You have a sack protector over your sack. This one is a silicone sack. And it pneumatically fills. So whenever you cycle the filler, pull it out all the way, push it inside, it creates air pressure inside the barrel, which deflates the ink sac.
Hmm.
And then when you push it all the way down, the pressure is released and the sac is allowed to inflate.
Cool. It was a really cool intermediate step to the next snorkel. Wow.
The snorkel came about because of the ballpoint.
Hmm. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, so the let's grab a fun one. Here we have a salesman's demonstrator model of the Sheaffer snorkel. The snorkel was first introduced to combat the ballpoint pen because nobody wanted to deal with bottled ink anymore. You buy a ballpoint pen, you take it out of the box, and it just writes.
Hmm.
You don't have to dunk a pen in ink. You don't have to wipe it afterwards. You don't have to worry about inky fingers. And the Schaefer took a look at the German U-boat designs, the periscopes, which they refer to as schnorkels. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but that was what gave them the idea for the snorkel system. How can we fill a pen without putting the pen in a bottle of ink?
That's very cool.
And it's in the marketing. There is no cleanup when using a Sheaffer snorkel. Yeah, you still need a bottle of ink, but you dip the tip of the snorkel, one stroke. You don't even need to wipe it when you're done.
Mhm.
And sure, it takes a couple of minutes for the ink to saturate through the feed, but they didn't
Yeah.
mention that in the marketing.
That's very cool. I hypothesized in my review video. I thought like if that snorkel had come out maybe 20 years earlier, I do think that that might have postponed the inevitable. I do think ballpoints were inevitable, but that might have given fountain pens another 20 years of kind of their heyday because that snorkel system was very cool to use.
I don't know. Ballpoints were already taking off in the 1940s. Bureau was doing good work.
Mhm.
Um,
Nice. When you're looking for like a vintage pen to buy, what are things that you kind of keep on the lookout, as a pro or a con? Is there anything that you're like, oh man, I got to get that pen? Or is there anything where you're like, oh, don't get that pen? Like, what are your kind of telltale signs when you pick up a used pen somewhere?
the biggest thing for me is that I look for, in order of importance to me, interesting filling systems, interesting nibs, and interesting materials. So those three things, if the pen doesn't have it, I generally don't even consider it. Now, when I do see a pen that I want, the first thing that I evaluate is the condition of the pen itself. Does the barrel have any cracks? Does the cap have any cracks? It's quite common to find hairline cracks where the clip mates with the pen cap itself. In fact,
Hmm.
especially so on these over the top clip models. I doubt there's any way this would come through on the camera, but there is a cap crack on this clip because of the way that the clip torques. If you pull on it, it forces the back of the cap inwards.
Yeah, I can see that. And I can understand too where that would be such a prominent place of failure because that's the pressure point when people screw in the pen. If they over tighten it, over torque it, that's where,
Exactly.
push comes to shove, and
It's
that's where that pressure's got to go somewhere.
it's very common to find cracked caps, if not where the clip mates in, then even just leading in from the lip of the cap upwards, which is typically stabilized by the cap band.
Hmm.
Um, Worse than that, I would say, would be a cracked barrel, especially in vintage pens that are not threaded. So what I mean by that is
Hmm.
if the section doesn't thread into the barrel, then the barrel cracks at the section. There's no way that section is staying in there again. I don't
Yeah.
care how much glue you use. For my part, please don't use glue. You properly chemically weld the, hopefully it's celluloid. If it's hard rubber, you're screwed. Maybe Ron Zorn can help you. Um, he runs Main Street Pens, and has quite a bit of repair experience. So when it comes to celluloid cracks, I have bought cracked pens, and it is possible to solvent weld the cracks, but it's a dangerous process. You need to use very harmful chemicals, and there's a lot of polishing afterwards. So generally, if a pen is cracked, I won't purchase it. After that, I would look at the nib. It's actually fairly common to find cracked gold nibs.
Hmm.
You give a pen, you give some plastic 80 years, it's going to shrink or expand. It's just the name of the game. Um, in fact, the vacuum fill pen that I displayed earlier does have a cracked nib. It cracks from the bottom of the nib leading upwards. So it was not a crack that was induced from writing. Conklin crescent nibs, for example, the breather hole is a crescent shape,
Hmm.
and the tips of the crescent actually focus stress when you're flexing the pen, and it's quite easy to crack one of those nibs by over stressing it while flexing.
Okay.
I'll look at the tipping material, see if one side maybe has the tipping missing, maybe the pen was dropped. Um, After that, if the nib looks good, I feel like I'm ready to buy the pen. I have a lot of experience restoring pens myself. I do not recommend trying to restore the Sheaffer vacuum fill system. Send it to Stacy Hill or Gerald Berg. Um, yeah, if it's just a lever filler, then it's no sweat off my brow. Snorkels can be annoying, but they're very doable. Touchdowns are just a lever filler with an extra O-ring as far as restoration is concerned.
Cool. You're making me feel like more able-bodied here to maybe jump in and see if I can get one on the cheap because all of mine fully restored, all my vintages fully restored, they're still, up there in price with most of the mid-grade to, or higher of modern pens. So they still fetch, anywhere from 150 to 300 type thing. Fully restored, like no cracks, no issues, like almost quote unquote mint condition type thing with like no patina, anything like that. So, and those, as far as I know, aren't super particularly rare models. So I can imagine like restored, if you've got something super rare, it could probably cost an arm and a leg. So,
Yeah, if you find the right seller or find the right buyer. And in terms of restoring, anyone considering their first restoration, I highly recommend finding yourself an unrestored Sheaffer touchdown filling pen. They are pretty common to find. You can find them unrestored on eBay for 30 bucks or less.
mhm.
Um, as far as the difficulty of restoration, they are all threaded section into the barrel. Um, so some gentle heat, maybe hold them a foot away from a hair dryer and just let it warm up the pen. Don't get the pen too hot because they are injection molded. It is a thermoplastic. If you get it too hot, it will expand.
Hmm.
So some gentle heating, um, unscrew the section from the barrel, A dental pick is perfect for removing the O-ring at the end of the barrel. You will need a screwdriver with a long shaft flathead to take the blind cap off of the touchdown tube. After that, it's quite easy. You just replace the sack, you put a new O-ring in the barrel, and you're off to the races. They're very rewarding to restore, and they sell a hell of a lot better than lever fillers.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, I've seen some not particularly that model, but I've seen a couple models between like 50 to 70 bucks that were unrestored, and I was almost about to like jump in and I didn't feel comfortable with my knowledge base, but I'm feeling a little bit better. Thank you.
Mhm. If you have any pen shows in your area, you can find quite a few unrestored pens for very nice prices.
I'm gonna try and hit the Boston one if I can. Well, it's outside of Boston, but I'm gonna try and hit that pen show. It's coming up next month. I'm going to the Pelican show with a friend
Mhm.
next month as well, but I don't think Pelican. Well, actually, I don't know. Does Pelican, is that a vintage brand? Did that go way back?
Pelican has been around since the 1800s, I believe,
They are a
late
vintage brand.
1800s. They're part of the German Big Three, I would call it, which didn't used to be those companies, but that's a whole other story.
What were the original big three of Germany?
So Mont Blanc is one of the oldest, of course. You have Pelican. Lamy was around, but I would say back in the day, Giha was more important than Lamy.
Thank you for the history on Pelican. Like I was saying, I don't really do any deep dives on unless or until I get something for review, and I haven't had a Pelican to review yet, so I'm still kind of in the dark. So I'm kind of excited to go to that show that someone invited me to because I'm going to learn a lot there too.
Oh yeah. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Pelican because I feel like Giha made superior pens, very controversial, I know, and Pelican absorbed and destroyed Giha. So, but I have a trio of German pens here. Um, I'll start, I guess, since we were talking about Pelican, we'll start with the Pelican Mark 30. Um, Very handsome pen, typical German architecture. You can have any color you want as long as it's black. Um, Piston filler, this one is a slip cap and has quite an interesting nib, which
Yeah.
looks almost like a beak.
Hmm.
Piston filler, blue ink window, black pen, gold nib, gold filled accents. Very, I would say, very common for Germany in the 1960s. Next up, um, I guess we'll do the Mont Blanc. This is a Mont Blanc number 22. Again, if you looked at these pens from 5 feet away, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. And again, typical German blue ink window, black pen, 14 karat nib, rolled gold accents,
Hmm.
and a fairly interesting, they referred to this as the butterfly nib.
A lot of it seems like a lot of people in the 60s were trying to scale down their nibs and incorporate it more into the body itself. What that reminds me of, this is like a Pilot long short, and
Yes.
it's kind of a similar nib where it's like it's not inlaid, but it's like tucked in the body. I
Mhm.
don't know how to describe it, but it's a similar aesthetic.
Oh yeah, I love the long shorts. They're actually a joy to use. Um, and then the third, yeah, that's actually the pocket. Which one is it? See, I can't even tell them apart when they're on my desk. Okay, the third German pen that I have is third verse, same as the first, black pen, rolled gold, piston filler. This is a Giha 725. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the German name, but they refer to this as a gold wing. And the reason for that, the nib was heavily inspired by Sheaffer. This is an inlaid nib.
Cool. Thank you so much, Sam, for taking the time to talk to us today. Unfortunately, I do have to get going. I've got some family obligations, but I'd love to sit down with you again and go over anything you'd like to talk about because you have a vast collection of not only knowledge in the vintage world, but I can see in the background there's a vast collection of pens we should take a bigger look at too. So,
Yeah, hopefully next time that will be a little bit more presentable.
and that's okay. No worries here, my man. Thank you so much for taking the time out again to talk to us. And it's been awesome talking and learning all about vintage pens because as you know, I know kind of bits and pieces and holes here and there, but it's awesome to kind of fill in those gaps. So thank you so much again for sharing all of your knowledge.
Certainly, and maybe next time as well, we can go into our vintage Japanese options.
Yes. All right. Episode 2, people. Stay with us. All right. Take care, Sam. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, have a good one. Thank you.